A columnist and a political commentator, Tracey Barnett, joins us this evening. Tracey, good evening.
Good evening, Pat.
Hey, we originally connected earlier in the week to talk about the midterms, but I love in your bio how it says passionate about women's issues, data, dignity, and the current train wreck of US politics. As we're recording this, about an hour ago, there was a certain announcement made by a certain orange-faced man in America that he's going to have a crack at being president again. It's not exactly a secret. We realize this has been coming. So before we even talk about midterms, hot off the press, so to speak, is there anything you want to say to that? Speak to that?
Well, of course. I mean, my God, Donald Trump running for a second term, a man who has been twice impeached, the second time by a bipartisan vote, a man who is under federal, potentially indictment in Georgia, under investigation in New York, a man who is handling multiple lawsuits to discredit him, and whose candidates lost significantly in this midterm, has just decided that this is the ripe old time to announce that he's the best contender to hold the mantle in 2024. It's an incredible thing, and it's in his mind a smart move, because this will pave off some, or hold off some of the grit that's coming through on these investigations in the next 2 years. Nobody has ever announced this far ahead of time. And we've got a long 2 years ahead of us, years ahead of us.
Absolutely. It seems that he also backed himself into a bit of a corner because, speaking of the midterms, of course, the much talked about red wave did not happen. If the much talked about red wave had have happened, then Donald Trump could have probably claimed a lot of, a lot of responsibility for said red wave. So of course
he said himself that he would claim credit. He even said it out loud. He would claim credit if the red wave eventuated, and he said, "I will take no blame or responsibility if it didn't."
He's ludicrous. But last week, when all the pundits were saying it was going to happen, he said, "I got a special announcement coming next week," obviously thinking he was going to come off the back of a victorious weekend where he looked like, still the orange face of the GOP. And then that didn't happen. And many commentators and establishment people are saying, you know what, maybe Donald Trump is to blame for this. And he definitely shouldn't announce, including Kayleigh McEnany, who was probably the most cutting commentary of the last week, saying he should not go to Georgia for the runoff and he should not announce a bid. But he's such a thin-skinned man. He's backed himself into a corner where if he hadn't have announced today, that would be tantamount to actually agreeing that it was part of the reason it was bad was because of him. So he has to come out now and say, I'm running anyway, because this was not how the book in his head was written. I mean, the book in his head is a comic book, but the book in his head that was written was going to have him off the back of a victorious midterm red wave saying, look at what I did for you guys. Now put me back in presidency. And so he stuck himself. He's backed himself into a corner, and he can now not come out at the same time and just try and run for 2 years.
I don't think he sees it that way. I
don't think he sees it that way. It's because he's deluded.
Well, let's just be more strategic in the way that Donald Trump attempts to think, which is that he feels he needs the spotlight. He thrives on it. He's successful at it. And he wants to be the kingmaker always. He wasn't this time, but it's his way of getting out in front, of being and demanding ultimate fealty to him. And so when he did this announcement at Mar-a-Lago, he invited many, many prominent Republicans, some of whom turned down his invitation because you're supposed to stay neutral in primaries. But he very carefully ticked off who attended and who didn't. And so his mafia style clamping down of loyalty is going to start early. And he figures that's the best way to capture that loyalty in this very first wave right after the election. They even had to hold him off announcing earlier than this. And they did successfully, at least till that point.
Yeah, and obviously is there the angle as well that he's got all these criminal investigations against him and investigations in general against him. He thinks that announcing, as you said before, is going to kind of stave off those investigations. But I think pretty common practice is if you are running for president, i.e. if you are the nomination of the party, the nomination, yeah, that's right, of the party, then
Right.
maybe you won't get investigated. But as one of potentially a dozen candidates beforehand, it doesn't change anything.
Let's clarify that. It's not that he thinks that these investigations are going to stop because he's the candidate. He is dealing with perception. He wants the perception in the eyes of the voters to feel that any of these investigations are politically motivated because
Yeah,
he's a viable candidate. And that's a different story. So
he can play the victim card.
Exactly. He can say, look, this is all political grist for the mill. Ignore the man behind the curtain. And there's many men and women behind the curtain who want some skin.
It's very ironic how often people who set up themselves as kind of a strong man or a strong person then want to actively play the victim when it suits them, which is exactly what they criticize their opponents of constantly doing. You know, it's the people who accuse their opposition of being snowflakes who melt down so quickly under criticism. It's the people who are saying don't be a victim who will play the victim card, and he is the quintessential example of that.
Right. Well, you know, it's going to be a fascinating, even a few months ahead, because already the gloves have started to come off for Ron DeSantis. So, for example, he said, "Look, I really advise him not to run for presidency. I have some things that I could say about him that won't make him look well." And you better believe he's going to have plenty of things to say about him. Already he's called him Ron DeSanctimonious. But that's just beginning. That's just beginning. And I have to say, and I don't think I've ever said this in one sentence before, but that is what is the key to Donald Trump's small brilliance, is his ability to go for the jugular. For him, politics is not just a blood sport. It's kill or be killed. And when the two of those start to tango, it will be fascinating to watch who runs to the establishment and who chooses something new. And that something new is a romance that has yet to happen and yet to be proven. Remember, Ron DeSantis did incredibly well in this election. But having said that, he ran against a really stale, old, white male candidate, Charlie Crist, who'd been around forever. And he'd also gerrymandered two very big counties and split the vote in black counties. But having said that, his win was definitive, and it was big, in literally Donald Trump's backyard. And Donald Trump does not like the smell of that at all. And we're soon to hear about it.
I've said this for a few days in a row now. Once the establishment looks like it's starting to turn against Donald Trump, just remember, people, they did that in 2014 and 2015 as well. The establishment was against Donald Trump. The grassroots, if you will, as Dave Chappelle describes them, the poor whites in Ohio got in behind him, and those were the ones that actually put him in there. And then the establishment had to get behind him. So just because the establishment's turning against him and all these commentators are saying it's DeSantis is the future, if he's able to pull off what he did last time and get the base behind him, they'll all look embarrassed again, and they'll all get in lockstep, and you'll see Ted Cruz again doing phone polling for Donald Trump, those photos we remember from the last election. So just because these things are happening doesn't mean it's a done deal.
Remember, Marco Rubio was in this position many years ago, and he got slayed by Donald Trump. So there's other pieces to put in this pie, which is Ron DeSantis has really been a Florida candidate, and he has not been really known in a wider sense on the national stage yet. And he has to introduce himself to voters in a way that's slick, in a way that's interesting, and a way that doesn't threaten people who support Trump. And that's going to be really, really a hard pull for him. And it will take a very savvy, very smart politician to jump through those hoops. So we have a lot of dominoes in front of us.
I'm also fascinated because we all remember what politicians say. Sometimes when you see what they're saying today, versus what they were saying yesterday, you go, do you remember there was a camera when you said that opposite thing? But Donald Trump, again, seems to be the extreme version of that. I was watching his announcement today live, and I tweeted out here, I'll bring it up. I tweeted this out. This was something that Donald Trump said today. He said, when the virus hit our shores, I took decisive action and saved lives. That's what he said today. I'm interested as to how his base responds, how Republicans respond. And for those who are watching to this rather than listening it, you can see I attached the GIF to that comment where he said, it'll go away at some point. It'll go away. You know, it's 15 cases. Very soon it'll be none. So he didn't act decisively. I know that. Anybody with any sense knows that. And he seems to be the one person, perhaps because he opens his big mouth so much, that's going to be so much easier to fact check on what he did say and what he is going to say for the next 2 years. Do you think that's going to make any difference at all to the election of Donald Trump?
No. And I think, Pat, you're behind the ball on this one. 71% of Republicans feel that the 2020 election was stolen. 71%. Donald Trump almost singularly has managed to forward that narrative. And his voters don't care if he was accused of sexual assault. His voters don't care that he may have done some nasty things in Georgia to change the vote. His voters don't care if his dealings in New York have, his financial disclosures were a ball of string. His voters don't care. They're voting for the man, for the persona, for what the person who they perceive as their leader. Yeah. And his policies are very, very, very far second to that in the perception, with the exception of whether another candidate can steal away this marriage of 7 years. Trump supporters have been married to this man. And if you have a young, sexy 44-year-old or anybody else who's going to be entering the race saying some of the similar policy things, but without the shouting, that might resonate in 2 years from now. Because remember, this is 2 years from now. That is a huge amount of time in American politics, in any politics. And if he has made any kind of tactical error, it is his ego wants him to declare himself king for the next 2 years so he can have front and center stage. But the reality is people are tired, and they're tired of the shouting. And it will be interesting to see, because the shouting is going to get a lot bigger before it gets quiet again.
And also, like, not to be the ultimate kind of downer here, in the current state of Donald Trump's health, what he's looking like, you know, his diet, all that sort of thing as well. There's nothing to say he's going to be around in 2 years' time. I don't wish that out loud. I'm not trying to be a prophet of doom, but 2 years is not just a long time in politics. It's a long time for someone approaching 80, you know?
That's not really an issue for me. I look at Nancy Pelosi, who's 82 years old and is still on the top of her freaking game. She is a force to be reckoned with. If any of the video that actually came out afterwards on January 6th, she was actually managing, trying to keep the vice president safe, trying to make sure that people weren't getting attacked. An 82-year-old was managing that just fine. Thank you very much.
I think it does. I think it does come into.
Doesn't really.
Well,
my first fear of Trump.
Okay, now I agree with what you said, the first fear, but it does come into account. Like, I think that if they run Joe Biden, they pretty much lose, no matter who they run against them. And one of the reasons for that, it's not Joe Biden today. It's Joe Biden at the end of his next term at 88. I mean, really?
86.
I mean, like 86. And it's like, I mean, I agree with what you're saying in theory, right? And individually, people can be amazing and sharp and quick-witted, and on top of it, up into their 90s. But that's not sort of what the norm is. And I think
I agree.
There is an aspect of age when it comes to Biden. And so I think that age can play a part in this conversation. And I do think that, I don't know who it would be, whether it would be a Newsom or whether it would be a Beto or whatever, but there's probably a better candidate. And if Biden doesn't run, they also get rid of, and I mean this with no disrespect, but the Kamala issue that Kamala Harris hasn't really hit with the public. and it's another way of moving, someone into that
Sure.
vice president seat that might be a better option to be voted for by the general public.
Let's go backwards for a second.
Sure.
My point wasn't that age is not a factor. My point is that's not the most important factor.
Yeah,
with
gotcha.
Donald
And
Trump
I
Donald Trump
agree.
Being elected.
I
Now,
agree.
let's talk about age for Joe Biden. By the way, if Donald Trump is elected to a second term, he would be the oldest candidate who has ever run for office, believe it or not. Joe Biden, age is absolutely the factor, absolutely. And what complicates things is Joe Biden has a speech impediment. Joe Biden muffs his words. Joe Biden has made small mistakes that make him look like he's not on top of it.
Yeah.
And all of that is not telegenic. And if there was a candidate, again, I'll just use Ron DeSantis as my example, like Ron DeSantis, a 40-year-old who is smooth, who is smart, who is focused, who would be on the debating stage with someone like Joe Biden, he would wipe the floor with him, absolutely wipe the floor with him. And I think everybody would look very nervous that suddenly we have this old man who can't really do the job, even though the reality of that might be very, very different.
Sure.
But beware, everybody has managed to always undervalue and underestimate Joe Biden. I, for one, was one of them. He wasn't my first choice 4 years ago when we were looking at primary candidates, but he was steady. He was known. He's been kicking around Washington for over 45 years. And he took a lot of Obama alums who had a hell of a lot of experience in how to get things done, who made good on the mistakes they made the first and second time around for the Biden administration. Mm-hmm. And he has managed to pass more legislation, significant, big legislation, than any other president in the last, I would argue, 50 years.
Yeah.
And even though right now, in the midst of the moment, we see Biden as ineffectual, I think history will look very kindly on him, even though he's going to have a split house going forward.
I think as well, credit where credit's due. We can talk about the midterms now, finally, Tracey. One of the successes of the midterms for the Democrats was Joe Biden. There was a huge groundswell of younger people supporting the Democrats in the polls, at least, prior to the day. A lot of that had to do with, the student loan relief. So he did some things. Is it octogenarian, whichever
octogenarian. We've got three of them: Nancy Pelosi, McConnell, and Biden.
But
the old guard is definitely still guarding the door.
Yeah, but this octogenarian got the youth base out for the midterms. So there's something, you can't, I'm not wiping him off. I'm just going, the general public thinks about an 86-year-old with the nuclear codes and goes, I don't trust my 86-year-old father with the remote control, let alone the freaking nuclear code. You know what I mean? I think it's a hard pitch to sell, put it that way.
Well, I guess the question will be, how I'd like to address that is, did Joe Biden get the youth vote out because of him, because of Joe Biden, or in spite of him? I think, 60 unmarried women went Democratic by 68%.
Yeah, of course.
68%. The youth went Democratic anywhere, depending on the state. For John Fetterman, they went 70% for John Fetterman. What's happened? Women, youth and women came out. Women were angry about Roe versus Wade, the Dobbs decision, and it was not just another news cycle. It was not something that most of the media thought would be tucked under the rug as the economy started to pull higher. The reality is, abortion mattered. Rolling back women's rights that we had held for 50 years mattered, especially to women, especially to single women. And the Republicans are going to have to smell the coffee on this one, because half of Republican voters have pretty good, are pro-abortion. Mm-hmm. So this one was a game changer. And young women came out and said, this can't stand. So did young guys.
I remember when Obama won, and it was very, very clear that women youth, and minorities had swung to the Democrats. And I remember thinking when Obama won, shit, the Republicans are never going to get in again. Because if those three groups swing so heavily Democrat now, and now it feels like it's taken this long to get back to the youth vote and women. But, there's a lot of research out there saying how much Latinos, for example, support Trump or support the Republicans at the moment. It's interesting to see that the minority voter isn't quite as strong in the Democratic camp today as it was when Obama was in there. There's been, I'm not saying it's still not the majority, but it's been a movement away from the strength that it was.
It's interesting because we have always lumped together the Latino vote or the Latinx vote. But a farm worker in Central California might be a diehard Democrat, and a business owner in Miami, Florida, who is of Puerto Rican descent, might be a completely different Republican supporter. They are not a homogeneous group, and that's really important to note. But I guess to go back to your question, I think there are many other groups that we haven't talked about yet. And one of those things is that married women and married men are leaning more toward Republicans. And we'll see what happens with Republican suburban women as well. And if there is such a thing as independents, if there is such a thing as independent voters, we still have to sniff them out. Because the narrative that is kind of false is that this was a disaster for the Republicans. This was not a disaster for the Republicans.
No, I agree.
We actually ended up within about 1 percentage point of what most of the polls had predicted. And what we've returned to is a stasis. We returned to basically where we were, which is America is split pretty much down the middle. And what flipped in different races, what held or didn't held, had to do with local politicians and who was running and whether they were good enough candidates. And believe me, there were plenty of Republican candidates that were just atrocious. But when they were atrocious, with the exception of Herschel Walker, they were voted out. So I guess what I want to say is what we have, if you look at this big picture, and let's talk again in December when these numbers start really shaking out. But the reality is that this is not unusual. In a midterm, usually the sitting president loses a huge amount of seats. This time he didn't, but he lost one of the houses. That's normal. And what we've seen is a nation that is divided. No big news there.
I also agree with you, though, the point about I've been talking about that because I talk about everything like it's sports. I apologize, Trace, but all my analogies are sporting analogies. And if you support the worst team in the country and they're playing the best team in the country and they lose by 1 point, then everyone goes, my God, didn't they perform well? But at the end of the season, it's still an L. They've still lost. And the other team still has the W and the points, So whether they had the red wave and they had like a 60-seat transition, or whether they didn't and they have a 2-seat majority, they still have the majority. So that's why I agree with you.
On the money. So what we're going to see going forward is House of Republicans controlled by Kevin McCarthy, who's just won or got the initial vote going forward. We're going to see the Senate controlled by the Democrats, and we will see sometimes what I call message bills be coming through the House, bills that the Republicans want to show their base they're standing for, knowing full well that the Democratic Senate will never stand for them. But what's put the brakes on anything changing dramatically is that because the Democrats still have control of the Senate, Biden still has the ability to appoint up to 85 judges, federal judges and appellate court judges, and that's important, as well as any Supreme Court openings that happen in the next 2 years. And of course, this is whether Biden runs again or not. And believe me, in just the last couple of weeks, it is not a done deal that he would run. It is not a done deal, especially if Trump is not the nominee. But I think he's smart and he's no fool. He's been around the block. He will wait till announce. He has no reason to announce early because he doesn't want to be a lame duck. And he's got presidential decrees ahead of him. And this is his potentially last lap, his victory lap on a long and fairly distinguished career of a man who's kind of done the best he can for a long, long time, and whether he has nothing left to prove. And if he knows that somebody else will be more viable at the end of the day, I suspect he'll step back. But it depends who he's running against.
I remember the photos came out quite soon after Obama wrapped up his 8 years of him jet skiing in Hawaii, looking like the happiest man in the world. Like it was almost you could see on his face, oh, thank God that's over.
Yeah,
I hope, like you're saying, a long and distinguished career. Whatever the Biden version of that is, I don't know, whittling on his front porch or something. I hope, he gets a chance to enjoy some of that as well. And I don't know whether that means run or not, but I guess I fear I fear the narrative of him running equaling Democrats winning, but I guess time will tell. Hey, look, let me just, because we haven't even talked about really the midterms properly yet, so let's just very quickly touch on this, because we've talked about Georgia a couple of times. Democrats, as you say, have the Senate. Now, President Trump said today that the Republicans have the House. CNN, I've got it on the other side, CNN still hasn't called that. CNN has got them at 217 as of time of recording this. They still haven't called that 217 to 207.
And so the New York Times, yeah.
I think that we're all thinking
we're still a couple of days away, but it is very, 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 very likely that they will reach 218, the 218 that is needed. I believe that the New York Times had them up a little bit higher than that, but currently the polls are talking about potentially, and again, nothing's over till the fat lady sings, but probably the Republicans are on track to take about 221 seats of the 218 they need for the majority.
Yeah. And the Senate, I guess this is the only question now remaining, is what happens in Georgia. On one level, it doesn't matter because the Democrats hold control. But on another level, it means that the vice president wouldn't be stuck in Washington for half the times having to cast a vote. It means that Sinema would be sort of taken out of the equation if she wants to get in there and, screw things up any sort of way, shape, form whatsoever. So it is still quite important. And I was thinking the Republicans seem better at playing politics. The right in general, the world over, seems better at playing politics than the left. And the right, with one voice, seem to have gotten behind candidates like Donald Trump, kind of putting their moralities aside. I just wonder now, because Georgia's nowhere near as important as it was, if that will kind of give permission to some Republicans to go, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to vote for this absolute, person who shouldn't never be within 1,000 miles of a Senate seat. And I wonder if you'll see Warnock easily win that runoff. Don't know, just wondering.
That race confounds me. There's a lot of smart people in Georgia, and I don't understand how Herschel Walker has captured almost half the vote. And it is confounding to me in every respect. I don't know. There will be a huge amount of money that's poured into this. I do disagree on one point, which is I do think this Georgia seat is still very, very important. Remember, we've got Semina and we have Joe Manchin, and they have put the brakes on a lot of legislation that could have gone through, just streamed through in these first 2 years. And to have 2 extra seats as wiggle room, i.e. the VP and 1 extra, is really, really important. And it does, as you said, take them out of the equation. So it's important to get Georgia, incredibly important. But it's also important from my own personal perspective. I just don't feel that Herschel Walker is the sharpest tool in the shed. And I think that's denigrating to tools. I think that it is denigrating to the chamber of the Senate to have a man who has lied so consistently and so blatantly about who he is. But then again, I could be talking about Donald Trump when I said that too.
Well, but that's the exact point, isn't it? And this is all this sort of hypocrisy that sitting on the outside looking in, you kind of go, Donald Trump today in his speech was talking about, alluding to the cognitive decline of Joe Biden and saying the wrong state he was in, and then saying, Herschel Walker, great man, get behind him, got to vote for him. It's like he's actually in cognitive decline. He does not have the ability to do this cognitively. Joe is getting old. Joe's words are fumbled. He's got a speech impediment. Yes, he's not as sharp as he was 15 years ago, but the actual cognitive decline of Herschel Walker is, it's so much exponentially worse at a younger age than what Joe Biden is. age appropriate decline versus, you know, I've been crashing into people in professional sport for so long and I have some kind of cognitive decline because of that. I really wonder, and I hope, but I guess we'll wait and see if there'll be enough Republicans that go, thank the good Lord, I don't have to vote for this guy now because it's over, that'll hand Warnock the win. I wonder. We'll see.
It was really close. And
Yeah.
remember, the third party candidate pulled 2 percentage points almost. And so it's confounding, but he is a force to be reckoned with. Although having said that, there's no way he should be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Hey, Tracey, it's been really fun to meet you and get you on board, have a bit of a chat. Tracey Barnett, columnist, is traceybarnett.co.nz. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I hope we can stay in contact and talk again. Maybe we will talk after December the 6th, isn't it, to see what happens there and see if the Democrats have 51 or 50. I was thinking with Manchin and Cinnamon, even if the Democrats have 51, that means if those two vote against it, it only gives them 49. So that still doesn't really solve that problem entirely. But hopefully...
Well, no, you actually then have still the vice president. So it would make them 52.
Right. But that would put it back to 50-50 then, wouldn't it? Because if it was 52...
Sorry.
If it was 52 votes, like if it was 52 votes for the Democrats and Sinema and Manchin voted against it, that would be 50 votes left for the Democrats. And that would give 51 votes to the GOP because there's 49 of them.
And you're forgetting the tiebreaker of the vice president, though.
Yeah. All right. Maybe my math's not working out right, man. Anyway,
we'll do the math later.
Yeah, Tracey, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'd love to talk to you again. It's been great.
Take care. Bye.